Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Detroit Institute of Arts Thursdays at the Museum program. I'm Amanda Harrison, a Community Engagement Manager with the DIA. Thank you for joining us. Just as a reminder, general admission to the museum is always free for residents in Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb County. So if you like what you see today, we want to encourage you to come down to see the real thing in person. Today marks the return of our favorite, Howard Rosenberg, who is joined by Ray Henney to share stories about some of the crowd favorites at the DIA. Christine Mark, our manager of volunteer development, is here to take your questions throughout the program. To ask a question, log into YouTube using your Gmail account or by leaving a public comment on this Facebook page. Kathleen McBroom is behind the scenes running our slide deck. And today I want to ask you to pay special close attention because we are going to be giving away these beautiful note cards from the DIA's gift shop to the first person who guesses the correct answer to our trivia question at the end and emails that correct answer to communityengagement@dia.org. Don't worry, there will be a reminder for you about how to do this, but do pay attention because Howard and Ray are going to be giving away that amazing prize. So without further ado, why don't we give them a warm welcome. Hi, Ray. Hi, Howard. Thanks
Hi,
for being here.
Amanda.
Hello, Amanda.
Hello, Howard.
Hello, Ray.
So, in today's tour, virtual tour, Howard and I will be discussing paintings that are beloved by visitors and some of which have a unique historic significance. Howard, it's so good to see you again, my friend, doing these with me.
Thank you, Ray. It's great to be back at the DIA Thursdays at the museum. A year ago, I had a stroke, and I want to thank everyone who sent me all those good wishes and all those cards. They were very special to me, and they helped me a lot. So thank you for that. And I want to give a special thanks to Ray for all the encouragement he gave me to get back onto the show. I really appreciate your friendship and your support. So let's get on with it. Next slide. There we go. James Edward Scripps. This painting you see is of James Edward Scripps. He was the publisher of the Detroit Evening News. In 1883, he headed a group of people to host an art exhibition of borrowed objects to display to the public, the Art Loan Exhibition. Around 5,000 paintings, sculptures, and other pieces were organized in a temporary exhibition. The citizens of Detroit came in droves, and the exhibition was a huge success. This is a painting by a local artist, Julius Gary Melchers. It's actually an engraving from Harper's Weekly on September 15th, 1883. And this is what it looked like. I mean, he gathered it right in his setting. So he answered a question, or the question was answered, that these people that put on the exhibition posed as to whether the city was ready to support an art museum. It became clear that a city the size of Detroit needed a permanent home for art. Funding was organized and plans made to establish a personal institution. In 1884, the original 40 incorporators, next slide, met for the first time. And 4 years later, they completed the building on Jefferson Avenue. So this is a painting of the first board of trustees of the Detroit Museum of Art, which was its original name, by Percy Ives. And James Edward Scripps is the second from the right. Right, there he is. So the original building was completed and opened on Jefferson Avenue and open to the public. This is a photo from the Walter Reuther Library of the building. It was a Civil War type of architecture. It was torn down in 1960 to make room for a expressway. In 1889, James Scripps went to Europe on an art buying trip. Among the paintings he purchased in Paris were this painting, Salvador Mundi, and the meeting of David Abigail, which we'll look at in just a moment. At the time of its purchase, Salvador Mundi was attributed to the great Renaissance painter Leonardo da Vinci. If you notice, it's attributed to an unknown artist. That's because it was a mystery for a while. But subsequent analysis has resulted in changing the attribution to Giampetro, a student of Da Vinci. We know this based on the fact that a study of pigments used in this painting revealed the presence of substances that were not available at the time Da Vinci was working, nor for 50 more years after Da Vinci's death. This is not unusual, as the art world is still struggling with authenticating paintings. However, this analysis was unavailable when Scripps purchased it, so he thought he was bringing back an original Da Vinci, which would have been a great buy and a great accession for the Detroit Institute of Arts. Let's look at this next depiction of Salvador Mundi. This is a painting of a man holding his right hand in the shape of a blessing and his left holding a crystal ball, a representation of the world. He is looking out of the picture frame directly at the viewer. Okay, next slide, please. Two important painting techniques are illustrated in both paintings. Chiaroscuro, the very strong, bold contrast between light and dark, and sfumato, the smoky type of painting technique that an artist employs to make shapes without outlines or to soften the transition between colors. These are both innovations that Da Vinci developed and taught, and are taught in art school today. This training is apparent in the painting that we own and the other painting. If we look closely, on the right is the painting we own. You can see that there are very soft changes in the borders that fade into each other with no strong or distinct lines, sfumato. And it's obvious to see the very dark darks and the very light lights, chiaroscuro. In November 2017, another version of Salvador Mundi, the one on the left, was sold to Prince Bader bin Abdullah for $450 million as an authenticated Da Vinci, another authenticated Da Vinci, the highest single amount paid for a painting ever. In November 2021, the Art Museum reported that the Prado, a highly respected museum in Spain, downgraded this painting to the workshop of Da Vinci. No one is sure where that painting is today, but Salvador Mundi's painting, attributed to Giampetro, is in the European Gallery of the Detroit Museum of Art. So come and visit.
Howard, I
Right?
know you love touring that particular piece.
I very much do.
Yeah, I know. In fact, sometimes, Howard, I think you tour it a little bit too much. You're walking around the halls like this,
Well, that's because I think,
it
you're right.
really makes a big impact on you.
That's right.
Thanks so much, Howard.
All right.
So, this wonderful painting from 1509 of Madonna and Child is by the founding father of the golden age of Venetian painting. Giovanni Bellini laid the foundation for the artistic revolution of the High Renaissance. He trained such Venetian masters as Titian, Tintoretto, and Veronese. Although oil painting had been used in Northern Europe for many years, Bellini was one of the first Italian artists to master oil painting. Bellini fully adopted the oil painting style, using linseed oil and building up the layers of color. Oil painting had various advantages to tempera painting, which had been used for hundreds of years. You use oil painting, isn't that right, Howard?
I use oil painting. I've never used tempura. Tempura is done with egg wash.
Yeah. I understand that oil painting dries slower than tempera, permitting the artist to better model the soft paint. You can use your end of your brush and different techniques to keep modeling the paint. Oil paint also could create natural light in a way that tempera paint could not. It facilitated depicting light and shadow with color to create defined images rather than relying on lines, which is what Howard just described with the Salvador Mundi. Oil paint also facilitates realistic skin tones and softer forms. Bellini combined the use of oil with careful draftsmanship and pure geometry, which was typical of the Italian Renaissance. Next slide, please. You can see those properties on this almost 4 feet tall and 4.5 foot wide oil on wood panel painting. The composition is of the Virgin's presentation of the Christ child who is giving his blessing. The traditional rendition of the baby Jesus had him looking like nobility or godlike, draped in majestic and royal robes. Bellini instead portrays Jesus naked and lifelike as he gently looks on the viewer. Mary has a youthful, soft face, but does not look at the viewer. Instead, she seems to look pensively in the distance, suggesting she is contemplating the inevitable fate of her child. Bellini is credited as further influencing Italian art with 2 other innovations. First, the use of a curtain. The use of a curtain behind the figures creates the illusion of inner space shared with the spectator. It establishes a more intimate relationship between the viewer and the subjects. Now, some scholars suggest that the use of the curtain may have actually been suggested by one of Bellini's pupils, a 15-year-old Titian. The second innovation is the landscape in the background. It is not historic Jerusalem or Bethlehem, or locations the Christian Bible places Jesus, but an accurate depiction of then contemporary countryside of Venice. Bellini did this to make the images more meaningful for viewers. Rather than aging the figures by showing them in an ancient setting, Bellini makes this image timeless, as this is a universal story meant to have present-day meaning. In the late 15th and into the 16th century, it became the convention in painting to portray biblical stories with contemporary clothes and settings. Here, Bellini portrays a pastoral landscape with a chapel, a shepherd with his flock, and other objects that could have actually been found in the Venetian countryside. He further captures the natural light that would have been present. Next slide, please. Mary holds the scripture in her left hand, which bears the artist's signature with the date of the completion of the painting in Roman numerals. Throughout the years, Bellini has been heralded by scholars as a genius of composition and color. Next slide, please. Indeed, in his 5-volume influential treatise called Modern Painters, John Ruskin, the famous 19th century English art critic and the Slade Professor of Fine Arts for Oxford University, declared 2 of Bellini's altarpieces as the 2 best pictures in the world. Viewed as England's leading critic during the Victorian era, Ruskin was a widely trusted authority on taste. Modern Painters became a generally accepted scholarly standard for evaluating painting. Ruskin believed that the finest art revealed truth and God's goodness in nature, thus affecting the morality of the viewer. Ruskin further praised Bellini as the last of the pure, godly masters, quote, who did nothing but what was lovely and taught only what was right, end of quote. Howard, if Ruskin was around today, I think he would have made the same quote about you and your art.
He sounds a little pretentious to me. Ray, I'm surprised that you didn't talk about Bellini's other achievement besides adding linseed oil to the pigments, and that's inventing his own drink. And I would expect a slide up of the Bellini cocktail.
You know what? Maybe we can celebrate that later, Howard.
All right.
Howard, oh, I should stop. Christine, are there any questions?
Yeah, there actually was one question.
How to make a Bellini?
Yeah, no, it wasn't how to make a Bellini, although I would like to know that. The question was about the Bellini painting and the book she's holding in her hand. You mentioned scripture, but do you have anything more specific on that?
I don't, unfortunately, I don't.
But you do have a nice close-up.
Yeah, and that's his signature with his with the date of the completion.
Notice how well crafted the hands are. Just it's amazing how.
Yeah.
You can paint the hands, which is even harder to paint than faces, I think.
Yeah, look at her fingers.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah. Where these works are in the European Gallery, we have a question about where this is hanging.
Right, they're in it's the Renaissance section. It's on the second floor. And actually, the painting that Howard just showed, they're in adjoining rooms. The Bellini and the
Just down the hall is the
Salvador
next
Mundi.
meeting.
Yeah.
That's right.
All right, Howard, you're up.
All right, my turn. So
finally, Howard, it's only been 2 years until you could present this at Thursdays at the Museum.
So this is true. I've been trying to present this since the first day that we made the Thursdays at the Museum, and it kept getting cut. So we're going to do this today no matter what. This is called The Court of Death. It was done in 1820 by Rembrandt Peale, an American painter. It's the largest painting in the museum. It measures 11 feet. Could you go back to that painting there? Thank you very much. It measures 11 feet, 6 inches high by 20 feet, 5 inches wide. Peale came from a family of painters. Now we can go to the next slide. Family of painters. His father, Charles Wilson Peale, and others were the early painters of the American Republic. For decades, this piece was a traveling showpiece, transported in wagons, next slide please, over rough roads or by train, and rolled up and restretched many times. By the time it was acquired by the DIA in 1885, 2 years after the DIA was formed, there were tears in the canvas as well as other damage requiring a great deal of conservation treatment. This painting is based on a poem by an Anglican bishop, Belby Portis. It told of war and intemperance, and it was composed to be a sermon to his congregation. The first lines of the poem spell out the setting of the painting. It states, "Deep in a murky cave recess, and it is here we find the personification of death reigning. As you see in the upper left-hand corner of the painting is the cave entrance where there is light and life, but inside the cave there is nothing but death." I think our pictures are kind of obliterating the cave, but you can see part of it. There you go. Very good. Thank you for that. Death is sitting on his throne in the center of the painting, with his foot upon the neck of a young man laid out just above the stream, which represents the water of oblivion. On either side of death are his subjects. On his left are the kneeling, alluring figures of pleasure and her partners in crime, remorse, intemperance, frenzy, and suicide. And beyond them is a group with disease and misery, gout, dropsy, hypochondria, fever, consumption, historical problems occurring in the 19th century. And on the right are consequences of war. A warrior with a look of someone agitated with ambition and revenge, carrying a sword dripping with blood. He's standing over his murdered victims, an infant and a widowed mother. Others are rushing off, including the personifications of want, dread, desolation from the warrior. Finally, the vulnerable old man being led to death by a wholesome young woman personifying virtue. Death holds no terror in the eyes of the virtuous old age. Peale wrote a letter to his friends 20 years after this painting was completed, in which he wrote a great deal about his painting. He intended the painting to be a sermon on discourse of life and death that could be understood by the unlearned and the learned. 32,000 people paid a quarter to view this painting, and its travels made Peale a profit of around $4,000. This letter also revealed that many of the models used for the painting were people from Peale's life. He wrote that his father was the model of the venerable, virtuous man. One of his daughters was leading her grandfather, and another daughter portrayed the act of pleasure, and his friend and art critic, John Neal, posed as the warrior. A friend was one of the women being trampled, and his youngest daughter was the baby. The corpse was a study from a subject at the medical school, a cadaver, and his brother Franklin stood in for the corpse. This painting was significant in the times in which it was painted and displayed. The public was experiencing what was called a Great Awakening nationwide. A return to religion was occurring, as well as a turn toward temperance. And this thought-provoking painting fit right in. Any questions, Christine?
Any mention of how long it took to complete this painting?
The question was just asked. I was in the museum the other day touring this in person, and it was asked. And the same answer I have is, I don't know. I don't know if there's any mention of it.
Yeah, he wrote so many letters about this painting. I wonder if it's searchable. That would be a fun thing to look for, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and sometimes, Da Vinci took 16 years to paint the Mona Lisa, a small portrait. Rivera took 9 months to paint all those rooms in Rivera Court. So it could be anywhere from a couple of months to years. I don't think it took years. My guess would be just a few months.
And being the largest painting he ever painted, I'm so curious as to how he hung it and whether he painted it like in sections or top to bottom. Like how did he
talked about in the letter that he had to expand his studio so that the canvas would fit. And I'm sure that he had to build scaffolding to get it done.
And we did that. Well, remember when the museum was being renovated, they, instead of moving this painting, they just covered it over.
Why move it?
It's too big.
It's too big. There's no opening and you could get it out. No,
you had to roll it up.
As long as it's framed. As long as it's framed, yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Right.
Here we go. On to the next one. But here we go, Howard. This oil on canvas painting by the French painter William Bouguereau is a much beloved work in the DIA's collection. Generations of Detroiters have been charmed by these two young, innocent girls sharing an intimate moment. For years called the Nut Gatherers, it has been recently determined that the artist actually intended the name to be the Hazelnuts. So now it is known as the Hazelnuts. Bouguereau was considered the quintessential salon painter, who during his life was significantly popular in France and America. He was a teacher who upheld the traditional values in art at the prestigious Académie des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Those values included classical subject matter and highly representational and realistic renderings. Notice how realistically painted these figures are. There is no sign of brushstrokes. The skin on the youthful faces is smooth. This is the result of a very disciplined technique dedicated to line and structure and the use of preparatory drawings and planning. Next slide, please. That method of painting was completely different from the then emerging Impressionist style with its spontaneous-looking brushstrokes. An example of an Impressionist style painting is on the right. Next slide, please. The canvas is large, almost 4 feet tall and over 4 feet wide, so the figures are nearly life-size, making the girls immediately relatable. The girls are dressed in classic, simple peasant attire in this wonderful natural setting. It's idyllic. It's an idyllic French countryside. The girls are framed in a background of trees, shrubs, and shadow, which sort of enhances the intimacy of the moment. One girl holds a handful of hazelnuts, suggesting the pair had just gathered them from the nearby hazelnut bush. Dirt, this is a charming feature, dirt at the bottom of the foot of the girl on the right suggests the simple pleasures of youth, walking barefoot with a friend in the countryside. The Bouguereau paints the girls also with this really interesting glance that sort of punctuates the intimacy of the moment, and it makes it more mysterious. Visitors often enjoy wondering if the girls are sisters and what secret or story they are sharing. Howard, I'm sure when you've toured this, that visitors like to talk about. They wonder what what's going on. I've heard many different kinds of scenarios in this. The other wonderful thing about this painting is it's such a tradition in Detroit. You've probably had this happen too, where a grandmother will bring their granddaughter and they'll ask us, where is the painting of the two little girls? My grandmother showed it to me when I was a little girl, and I want to show it to my grandmother. So that's just
A big draw.
yeah, it's extremely it's a wonderful kind of Detroit tradition. Next slide, please. Here are two other Bergerac paintings in the DIA's collection, and they are both currently displayed alongside the hazelnuts on the third floor of the museum. Bergerac built his popularity by creating art that romanticized life in the countryside, the innocent spirit of childhood, the special connection between friends and family. His way of painting was innovative at the time because he treated the subjects like symbols of hope, fraternal love, and loving family. Next slide, please. Ultimately, the fresh faces, smooth skin, and bare feet remind us of the vulnerability of youth, of that privileged world of simple pleasures and intense friendship before the responsibilities of adult life begin. Howard?
Ray, thank you. This is another painting provided us through the efforts of James Scripps. Again, in 1889, James, while in Paris, outbid the country of France to win this painting at auction. This painting is done by Peter Paul Rubens and his workshop. Rubens was a Flemish painter and a diplomat. He was a versatile and influential Baroque artist from Northern Europe in the 17th century. He was well educated and a member of the Antwerp aristocracy. He kind of looks a little bit like an aristocracy kind of guy, don't you think, Ray?
Yeah, that's how you looked when I first met you, Howard.
No, I never had to grow teeth.
Oh, that's right.
And I still didn't have the hair, but other than that, maybe. He was assigned by the rulers of the southern Netherlands as an ambassador and also became painter to many courts of Europe. So he had two jobs. He was a diplomat and he was a painter. I don't know if there's any like that today. The meeting of David and Abigail portrays a biblical narrative of action and romance from the Old Testament's first book of Samuel, when Abigail makes her offering of loaves to David. The tale starts when Abigail, afraid that David will attack her husband Nabal for refusing to pay for his protection, she and her servants gather together gifts of food to appease approaching troops. Thanks to her beauty and elegance, Abigail succeeds not only in avoiding war, but also in eventually winning David's heart. Rubens presents the story through a number of contrasts. On the left side of the painting, you see Abigail's court, a cluster of pretty women in beautiful silks, bare-chested porters offering bountiful bread baskets, and a docile donkey. And on the right side is a display of horses in shining armor and mail with cloaks and saturated colors. David's horse with wind-blown mane seems primed for action. The soldiers are alert and ready for battle. We can see that both sides of the action are leaning in as they're looking to see what will happen next. Abigail is bending the knee to David, offering her gifts, while David is reaching out to lift her up. The Bible story goes on to tell us how later she and David would marry after God strikes Nabal dead for his behaviors. Love wins out at the end. Questions, Ray? Love story?
Howard, I do want to point out that those women over the shoulder of Abigail are in contemporary clothing. So Rubens, certainly in the 17th century, was following that convention.
And the other thing to point out is, what are those three soldiers leering at?
Well, I think Ray just
Oh, Howard, it's great to have you. Boy, you're back, I tell you.
Howard, didn't Ray just mention a couple of voluptuous women in the background?
Yes.
Yeah. So.
Yes. We know what he's looking at too.
Okay. Well.
Right.
So here we go, Howard.
All right, we're ready, Ray. You ready for this?
Here we go. Toward the second half of the 19th century, the traditional realistic style of paintings, such as the hazelnuts on the left, was the accepted and the popular. The Impressionists were emerging to challenge the traditional style with their spontaneous brushstrokes and exploration of light. The Monet on the right, which is in the DIA's collection, is from 1876 and is a wonderful example of Impressionism. But notice that the composition is still representational. It can be easily understood what's going on. It's a woman in a garden scene. Then, the American painter, James Abbott McNeill, came along. Next slide, please. And in April 1877, he submitted this painting for the inaugural exhibition at the newly opened Grosvenor Gallery in London. The exhibition presented artworks that were rejected by the traditional British Royal Academy of Arts. This nearly totally abstract painting Whistler painted was completed in 1875, a year before the Monet on the previous slide. Whistler's painting was shocking to the public. Whistler named this oil on canvas Nocturne in Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket. Why did Whistler create a painting that was so non-representational and so abstract beyond even the paintings of the Impressionists at the time? Why did Whistler call it a nocturne in black and gold? Howard, let's explore. Next slide, please. Here we have Whistler's self-portrait entitled Arrangement in Gray, Portrait of the Painter, which is in the DIA's collection and is currently exhibited alongside the Nocturne in black and white. Black and gold, and that's on the second floor of the DIA just off of Rivera Court. Whistler was born in Lowell, Massachusetts, and moved to London, England in the early 1860s, where he primarily resided ever since. He started his artistic career doing etchings that were highly representational. Then he turned to paint, pastel, and watercolor. Next slide, please. By the 1870s, Whistler began to find his own style that coincidentally was remarkably like Degas. On the left is a Degas painting from the DIA's collection. You can see that both artists use loose brushstrokes and create paintings that had an unfinished appearance. Surprisingly, there even was a bit of competition between the two artists at the time. However, while the Impressionists were interested in depicting everyday life through light, color, and spontaneous brushstrokes, Whistler was more interested in the aesthetics of painting. He felt that painting should be enjoyed for its formal qualities, such as expressive brushstrokes or coloring, rather than being representational, narrative, or depicting moralistic or sentimental subject matter. Next slide, please. What mattered for Whistler was the experience of the sensory quality, the paint, the color, the form, and the design, and how those elements made one feel. Whistler was one of the founders of the British aesthetic movement. According to the aesthetics, the real concern of art was beauty, not meaning or symbolism. Beauty is in the line, the color, and the brushstroke itself, independent of the subject matter. The aesthetic movement was, simply stated, art for art's sake. Next slide, please. Whistler believed that painting should be perceived and enjoyed as one perceives music through emotions and senses. Whistler famously wrote in his infamous book, The Gentle Art of Making Enemies, quote, "Music is the poetry of the ear, and painting should be the poetry of the sight. And the subject matter has nothing to do with harmony of sound or of color." The great musicians knew this. Art should be independent of all claptrap, should stand alone. Accordingly, Whistler named his paintings after musical compositions, such as arrangements, harmonies, nocturnes, and symphonies, to evoke music's abstract nature. Next slide, please. In this painting, Whistler aggressively advanced the aesthetic style. The painting is so abstract that it's hard to understand what is going on. When I toured this painting in the museum, and you may have had the same experience, Howard, visitors often have trouble figuring out what is what. Most are somewhat clueless until they look at the title of the painting. And the subject matter actually is of a fireworks display over London's Cremon Pleasures Gardens on the Thames. Next slide, please. Yet even in close detail, it is difficult to discern the fireworks in the center of the painting, which is the close-up on the left, or the figures of the people in the foreground, which is the close-up on the right. Next slide, please. A nocturne is a musical composition inspired by or evocative of the night. This painting is about the beauty of the night and of the dark, not of light and dark, but dark. He submitted the Nocturne along with 7 other paintings that were displayed in the Grosvenor exhibition. Whistler priced the Nocturne at the then large amount, very large amount, of 200 guineas. A guinea equaled about £1 and 5 pence. Then, on a fateful day in May 1877, next slide please, John Ruskin, the then famous art critic and historian we discussed earlier, visited the Grosvenor Gallery for an article reviewing the exhibition. Next slide, please. Ruskin was immediately enamored by the work of traditional painter Edward Burne-Jones, who was little known at the time. This wood engraving of the exhibition happens to feature the room where Burne-Jones' paintings were hung. The arrow points to the paintings. Next slide, please. Here are some of Burne-Jones' paintings that were hung in that room. You can see they are highly representational and formal with traditional biblical, literary, and allegory themes. These paintings satisfied Ruskin's criteria for art. He highly praised Burne-Jones in his review of the exhibition, published in June 1877. Keep in mind that Ruskin believed that the artist's main duty is to observe and express nature, which is the representation of God's goodness. Ruskin believed art that captures this truth could, therefore, uplift the morality of the viewer. Next slide, please. On another wall in the gallery, Ruskin encountered Whistler's Nocturne in black and gold, and he hated it. He hated the painting. He strongly voiced his disapproval of the painting in his published review. Next slide, please. He leveled harsh criticism, which included this now famous sentence: "I have seen and heard much cockney imprudence before now, but never expected to hear a coxcomb ask 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face." A coxcomb, Howard, is a really negative term at the time. It means like a joker or a jester or a clown.
Plus,
Don't have any ideas. Don't have any ideas of calling me that now, all right? Just, I'm not trying to give you any ideas.
But what a cranky old man he is, Ray.
I know he is, in that picture particularly. Well, Whistler was stunned by Ruskin's review. Ruskin had smeared not only his art, but his legitimacy as an artist. Whistler decided to sue Ruskin, and he retained the barrister John Perry to bring a libel action against Ruskin. Now, under English law, the standard for a libel claim was whether the offending language was not, quote, fair art criticism. Whistler's decision to sue was not entirely vindictive. Some scholars have interpreted his decision as a savvy business move because he was in a very precarious financial situation due to his then current indebtedness. Attorney General and Chief Counsel of the British Crown, Sir John Hooker, he's the one on the right, represented Ruskin, and Perry, who represented Whistler, is on the left. Because the case was determined by a jury, and there was a generally very negative reaction to Whistler's painting, Hooker made the shrewd strategic decision that Ruskin's defense would not solely focus on whether Ruskin's comment was or was not, quote, fair art criticism, but on whether Whistler's Nocturne could be considered art in the first place. So, on November 25th and 26th, in 1878, in a courtroom in London, there was a 2-day jury trial to determine whether the modern art movement, which rejected traditional standards of painting, was worthy of being considered fine art. It embodied the historical crossroads of art at the time, the struggle between the established and the new. Next slide, please. Each side called 4 expert witnesses, 2 artists and 2 art critics, to opine on the question of what qualifies as art and whether Nocturne fits into that definition. One of the artists who testified on Ruskin's behalf was Burne-Jones, whose paintings Ruskin praised in his review and who also happened to despise Whistler. Burne-Jones essentially testified that Nocturne was nothing more than a sketch, and it was deficient in form and color, and it didn't really qualify at all as a good work of art. Whistler also testified, and Howard, he fully enjoyed the spotlight. During his cross-examination of Whistler, Hooker asked Whistler, "How long did it take you to knock off your painting?" Whistler responded that it took just 2 days. Hooker then asked if Whistler really believed that 2 days' labor is worth 200 guineas. And Whistler responded famously, quote, "No, I ask it for the knowledge I have gained in the work of a lifetime," end of quote. Whistler's response reflected a new concept about art and being an artist. The artist was no longer simply a craftsman, but the creator of aesthetics. Though Whistler claimed damages of £1,000 in addition to his court cost, he was only awarded a single farthing in damages and no court costs at all. A farthing was only worth about 1 penny. The jury essentially did not really render a decision on modern art, but rather those of Victorian gentlemen who would sit on a jury were more or less commenting on Ruskin's crass language of calling Whistler a coxcomb. And see, juries won't like it if you start doing that, Howard.
I'm sorry, Ray, that I wrote that about you once.
This cartoon of the day depicts the judge offering 1 farthing to Whistler, who is on the left, while Ruskin is on the right. This was a major setback for Whistler because not only did he not win enough in damages to satisfy his current debts, but now he additionally owed substantial fees to his own attorney. Now bankrupt, Whistler sold his lavish house in London and set off to Venice to work on a commission of etchings. Next slide, please. As I had mentioned, the libel suit of Whistler versus Ruskin is indicative of the crossroads in both art theory and practice. The process of this change occurred in the late 19th century and into the 20th century. It was a transition from the concrete to the abstract, from the objective to the subjective. Further, it signified a change in the meaning of the term artist. Previously, the term meant an artisan or craftsman. An artist, in this new sense, was a person who possessed creativity, sensitivity, heightened intuition, and imagination. Emphasizing creativity over rationality allowed the artists the freedom to create from their own imagination and innovation. Howard, we are so fortunate that this beautiful painting, so significant in the history of art, resides in the DIA's collection.
Ray, imagine what would happen if Ruskin had seen a Van Gogh and a Rothko would have just finished the guy off. I understand.
He would have been writing his fingers to the bone.
Yeah, I understand that Ruskin didn't have such a good outcome with this thing too. Didn't he die soon after this?
Yes,
Didn't bitter and angry about the whole thing.
They both were. The trial really was a terrible. The result was terrible for both. Whistler didn't recover what he had hoped to recover, and Ruskin, was dragged through a trial. Actually, he didn't even appear at the trial because his health was so poor that Burns Jones fellow filled in for him at the time.
Right. Ray, I have two questions.
Yes.
Do you know the answer to these two questions? One, why did this picture even get allowed to be in the exhibition to begin
Well, the
with?
exhibition, the Grosvenor exhibitions was the first one. There was the inaugural exhibition, and the exhibition was specifically for modern paintings that had been rejected by the Royal Academy. And this was only one of 8 others, Howard. And the other 7 were, they were in the Impressionist style, but they were clearly representational. You knew what was going on. This was the extreme. This was the extreme painting. And you know what? I think a little controversy. I'm speculating, but something putting up controversial in your first exhibition, not a bad idea.
And did he ever sell this painting?
Yes, it was sold.
For how much?
That I don't know.
Okay. All right. Well, good. I'm glad he sold it.
Christine, are there any questions?
Well, I think Howard covered the whole gamut.
Okay, great. Howard?
Yes.
Let's go on to another favorite of the DIA. People love this painting.
Officer of the Hussars, Henry Wiley, an American painter. Officer of the Hussars was painted by Henry Wiley in 2007. Wiley is an American painter, born in Los Angeles, trained at the San Francisco Art Institute, and received an MFA at Yale in 2002. He trained as a classical painter in the old master style of portraiture. He's currently in his mid-40s. I love the suit. Ray, what do you think about his suit?
I think we should get matching suits like that when we're in the DIA.
We talked about that at one point, remember? when Paul was going to be...
yes.
Yeah. Okay. So Wiley takes European masterworks and uses them as platforms upon which he can insert the black body into the canyon of Western painting, creating a new idea of black masculinity and producing works to counter the wrong ideas that many people hold about black males. Wiley's figurative paintings and sculptures refer to heroic historic sources and position young black men in that field of power normally reserved for white men. His process is to walk the streets of Harlem, looking to cast an individual to paint, somebody he doesn't even know. He just approaches somebody he finds interesting on the streets and talks to them about what he does, about his process, what he does. He has a camera crew with him, so he's not just some random guy saying, "Let me paint you." He can present himself in a pretty professional style, and he takes the model that he selected that has said, "Yes, I'd like to do this," back to his studio, where the model will look through images of classical European art, finding a painting he likes, such as the one on the right. Wiley then photographs his model in his own clothes, in the model's own clothes, and paints him into the scene of the painting selected. He depicts contemporary sitters in historical settings. So let's compare the two paintings. And you can compare them at the museum because this painting is a little photograph below and to the right of the painting of the Officer of the Hussars. This is called the Charging Hussar. It's a very famous painting by Theodore Géricault that's in the Louvre Museum in Paris. So you have a horse that's very powerful itself. Sitting upon the horse is a Hussar, a Hungarian mercenary who signed up to fight for Napoleon in the war around 1812. He was leading a charge into Russia. You can see in the background the death and destruction of the attack. Wiley's officer of the Hussar depicts a young man atop a stallion in a historic pose, depicting heroism, strength, power, and victory. Wiley creates a contemporary spin on the previous existing work of art, but he does take out the background and substitutes it with what could be considered wallpaper. And the frame was made by Riley, by the workshop of Riley. What Riley didn't paint all this himself. He had help with his workshop, just like the old masters, like Van Gogh, like Da Vinci, or Michelangelo, or any of the Italian Renaissance painters did, who painted the things in. But he painted the man himself, who was wearing his own shoes, his own t-shirt, his own jeans, holding the knife of the hussar, looking powerful and distinct. Wiley also painted the official portrait of President Barack Obama. The chrysanthemums, for example, reference the official flower of Chicago. The jasmine evokes Hawaii, where he spent the majority of his childhood. And the African blue lilies stand in for his late Kenyan father. So this is a wonderful painting of the president, as is the painting of the hussars that the DIA has in its galleries. Christine?
Kathleen, can you go back to the Wiley paint? Yeah. Howard, this is, first of all, it's huge. And I'm sure you've had that experience from when visitors see it for the first time. They have to giggle about it. It's just It's huge. It must be 10 feet by 10 feet. It's extremely large. And what I always find interesting, too, is that the shoes are Timberlands. You can see the whole Timberland type.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Ray, for remembering that for me.
Yeah. No, it's sort of a novelty. The other thing that I think is interesting is that he designed the frame.
Yeah, I said that.
Yeah, I don't know, but I think it's interesting that he designed a frame. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's great.
Questions, Christine?
Actually, everybody is just hanging on and listening. I don't have any question right now.
All right.
So, should we do the question for today? The giveaway?
Go ahead.
All right. So Amanda had shown in the beginning earlier that she's got a giveaway of those lovely cards. There they are. Mary Broderick, who did an earlier Thursdays at the Museum, the first one in May, where they did art making. She did these particular cards, which I guess are beautiful when you see them. So
the value of $21.95.
There you go. So the question is, what were the nuts the little girls were gathering in the William Bouguereau painting? What were the nuts the little girls were gathering in the William Bouguereau painting? And at the bottom of the screen, you can see where you should send your answers: communityengagement@dia.org. Howard, you want to close us out, my friend?
I'll do it. So the end of TATM is always a pleasure to serve you. Today it's a pleasure to be with you, Amanda, Christine, Kathleen. Thank you all. Next week, May 26th, there's going to be a concert here. I believe it's Susie Abra Filippa, an American composer, a percussionist, and a sound artist, will be presenting her work. So same time, same place, Thursdays at the museum, Thursday afternoon at 1 o'clock. And until then, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.